Evening, everybody. We're waiting on our guest. Hi, Xander. How you doing? Hey, Robin. We're waiting on our guest, who I imagine will be along right around 6. There she is. Ah, fabulous. Welcome, Sarah. I know you're just getting connected. Can't hear you yet. There's Kelly.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello.
Welcome. It's lovely to meet you. I'm glad you're here.
Thank you.
I think we're going to have a nice audience for you this evening. I see some colleagues coming in. A couple of classes have assigned this as extra credit. So, which is great. I mean, it means an audience, right?
Sure. How are you doing?
We're good. It's cool. Are you in New York City? You're in Brooklyn?
I'm in Brooklyn. I'm right around the corner from you guys. Yeah. Well, I don't know what campus you would be at, but yeah, I'm in Fort Greene.
Fort Greene. Okay, so the campus is Midwood, but I'm in Upper Manhattan, and I have students. One is in Vermont. I've got I don't know where everybody else actually is. The
Yeah.
guy Xander who just raised his hand is up in Vermont on a family farm.
That was like my quarantine basically from March until about a month ago. We were
Ah,
in rural Ontario, just a few hours north of Toronto.
fabulous.
Yeah.
I've got one of my colleagues teaching from up there, right? I mean, this is one thing that this makes possible.
Yeah. Yeah, it's nice. It was kind of cool to be physically very isolated, but still really able to be part of these kinds of communities from a
Right.
distance was good. It's like, yeah,
I mean, let's all be candid about this. It's kind of mixed,
sure.
right? It's
For sure. You know, because I was so isolated for the first many months when things were truly locked down, we were like really rural. My best friend who lives in Toronto would complain to me all the time about how hard it was not to be able to hug people. And I didn't really get it because I wasn't seeing like I just wasn't seeing people at all. But now coming back, it is really weird not to have those normal social rituals that kind of like anchor you and start normal encounters. It feels like, yeah, I feel like things are not starting the way that they're supposed to start because those things that make us feel connected and like this is the beginning don't happen.
I think that's exactly right. And there's lots about this. That's. Did you must have gone to the conference, the oral history conference earlier or late
Yeah,
last week, right?
yeah.
Uh, Did you do the Second Life component of this thing, this sort of gaming version of meeting people?
I didn't. I did a tour to kind of like check it out and see if I might want to do it. And then I
I,
decided I probably didn't want to do it. Did
I
you?
had I had exactly the same experience. I took one of these, virtual explore it things, and I thought, no, this is a different generation that enjoys this. This is not me.
Yeah. I mean,
Because
I can imagine like maybe with better technology, that kind of thing, like could be, probably is, will be really cool. But it was just such a, it felt like, 101 of that whole thing. Really poorly sketched little avatars, and it felt really stilted.
and I don't really know how to have those conversations in the first place. So if you add this layer of technological complexity, I couldn't pull it off. So I attended a number of the talks, and some of them were quite great.
Which ones did you go to?
The keynote and the one about stories that recording stories of COVID, and
Uh-huh.
the Black Lives Matter one. So I
Yeah,
went to some of the bigger public ones
right.
that were available.
Cool.
And it was, I missed the conference. I mean, I like to go when possible.
Yeah. I mean, it's really the only conference that I go to. Um, so I can't compare it to others, but I imagine it probably has a pretty different feeling than a lot of the other academic conferences.
In my opinion, yes, it's a little less uptight,
Yeah.
a little less filled with the. I used to joke about the dinosaurs, and now I am one of them. But okay. So we are filling up. It's very nice. At this point, we have something like 33 folks with us, which is a terrific attendance in my estimation. It's lovely to see a number of my colleagues in our audience. What I'm going to propose is I'm sharing my screen here. Okay, some of my students are still coming in. Um, it's about 5 after or so, so I'm going to take the first couple of minutes and do a little bit of housekeeping, you might say. And then I think what we'll do is we'll ask you to talk for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and then open the floor. All right, as long as you care to speak.
Sure.
But our agreement was approximately an hour or so, and we will make an effort to end somewhere in the 7 o'clock range in an effort to be conscious of your time.
Okay.
Um, and so, okay, so here we go, guys. Welcome to those of you who don't know me and what we're up to here. There are lots of familiar faces, which is lovely, but also some folks who are new. I am Professor Napoli. I am an associate professor of history in the Brooklyn College History Department. I am currently the chair of the department. And this is my class 40, History 4200, Oral History Theory and Method. A number of the folks in the audience are my students. Um, Tonight we have a guest, and I'll introduce her in just a moment or two. But before I do a little bit of housekeeping, there are some upcoming history department events I want to direct your attention to. On Thursday, November 12th, where there's a panel on a conversation about race and racism in Indian history on Thursday, the 12th, between 12:25 and 3:30 p.m., hosted by my colleague, Professor Banerjee. And then another panel on Wednesday, November 18, concerning race and racism and its historical roots in Brazil. And finally, at the end of the semester, Professor Wills, will you wave to us, Professor Wills, please, is hosting a panel about recovering silenced voices, building archives of everyday experience, which of course touches directly on what we're doing together here in oral history. For the Zoom links to any one of those events, all of you guys are welcome and invited. Please email Professor Mencia. Her email address is here on the slide, and I will drop it into the chat at some point during the course of the evening so that you can capture it. There is stuff going on in the chat, and I will be monitoring the chat as the evening goes along. I also, because I am who I am, I got to tell you, we have social media. Look, guys, I'm the chair of this department. I got to tell you, you got to check out our social media, because that's where we post all the stuff about events and other things that are useful to you as history students and students at Brooklyn College, generally speaking. So here's our social media account links. I'll drop this into the chat also as we're going on along. Tonight, I need you to know that I must take attendance because the event is being paid for by college funds. They have a policy that I have to let them know how many people came and who they were. The event will be recorded. This is part of my class, so that's a routine element of my class. If that shapes how you elect to behave, I would certainly understand if you want to keep your screen, pardon me, your camera off or something of the kind. Um, Ms. Sinclair will talk to us for 20 to 30 minutes. I'm going to ask you to hold your questions or drop them into the chat. I will be monitoring the chat. And I'll keep them available to us. I'll open the floor to questions when the talk is done, and we will end our conversation at approximately 7 o'clock or thereabout. So with that, I would like to introduce our guest. Sara Sinclair is the author of the brand new, just released How We Go Home. My copy is sitting right here with me as I'm making my way through it. It's a collection of narratives about the living legacy of the loss of Indigenous lands and life as a result of resettlement, war, and treaties. Ms. Sinclair has contributed to the Columbia Center for Oral History Research COVID-19 Oral History Project, the Narrative and Memory Archive, the Obama Presidency Oral History Archive, and the Robert Rauschenberg Oral History Project. And indeed, co-edited or edited with Peter Bierman and Mary Marshall Clark at Columbia, the Robert Rauschenberg Oral History, a book published by the Columbia University Press in spring 2019. And Ms. Sinclair is a graduate of Columbia University's Oral History Master of Arts program, and I need my students to know I have 2 students in that program right now, right? You can go on to this to do this kind of work. She's conducted oral histories for the International Labor Organization's Regional Office for Africa and worked as an oral history consultant for the New York City Department of Environmental Protection, among other projects. And with that, I want to say I'm really grateful and excited to have you here. I think my excitement is shared by colleagues in English and in anthropology and in history. I see a whole raft of faces, and we're thrilled to have you and to learn from you about your work. So with that, I'm going to make you a co-host so that you can share the screen as you might like to do. So Sara, thank you very much, and let me get this done.
Thank you.
Here we go, participants. There you are. Okay, more. Co-host. Good. I think you have all
I have the abilities now.
to do what you need to do.
Cool. Thank you. Okay, so it's really nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me. It's kind of funny. It's the first time I've actually done an event with my own borough a while back in my own borough, but not together. So it's strange, but but also nice to kind of feel like we're sort of in the same space. So I wanted to start today by sharing 2 different stories. We're going to be talking about narratives of resistance and amplifying narratives of resistance. And mostly I'll be talking about that in the context eventually of my book, How We Go Home. But to start, I wanted to share 2 different stories. The first one is about a moment back in time a little bit, December 29th, 1890, which was the date of the Wounded Knee Massacre. I don't know how many people are familiar with that event, but in 1890, the Wounded Knee Massacre occurred, which was a conflict between the US 7th Cavalry Regiment and the Lakota people on the Lakota Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. And it resulted in the massacre of up to 300 Lakota individuals and the death of 25 US soldiers. What's significant about this particular event is that for a long time, historians kind of viewed it as a really important moment and perceived it to be the end of the Indian Wars. There was a really famous text that came that looked at this event. It was called Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee by historian D. Brown. And it was very, very well read, huge bestseller, reprinted many, many, many times, but it became this sort of emblematic depiction of Indigenous trauma and despair. And it was, this is the moment at which the settlers won the wars against the Indian people. But of course, that's not really what happened because Indigenous people are still here. And since that, and in the last few decades, those kinds of events and that history has been reframed by new areas of study like settler colonial studies, indigenous studies, who instead of viewing the settlers arriving in the Americas as an event, instead view it as a structure. And so when you change the way that you look at the settlers arriving in the Americas, you see that the massacre at Wounded Knee was just one event among many that Indigenous peoples have survived and have resisted. And I think it's really important to know that when you're thinking about resistance in terms of Indigenous peoples, that for most of us, we think of our lives and the fact that we exist and that we have survived attempted genocides to be an act of resistance in and of itself. The second story is much more recent and much more close to me. And that is that a few years ago when I should say that this book, How We Go Home, was originally, it had its origins as my thesis when I was a master's student at Columbia. I came to the school with an interest in doing work about contemporary Indigenous stories and with contemporary Indigenous life. And I started to meet fellow students who were, studying at Columbia and NYU and other colleges in the New York City area. And I started to hear an arc, a repeated arc, which was, I've come to study and my plan is to move home again and work for my nation. Or I have left and I have attained degrees and then I have gone back to work for my nation and now I'm here studying again. And I started to have these conversations and thought, oh, well, this is a beautiful thesis arc because it's such an incredible story. And the people that I was speaking to were able to narrate American history in a really, really interesting way that I thought would serve both Native and non-Native readers. So I really quickly envisioned that my thesis would become a book one day. So when I graduated, I was kind of shopping this idea around, and I had a meeting with a not-for-profit that works with narratives and is especially interested in telling stories about injustice. And so I sent her a sample narrative, which is one of the ones that's still in the book, of a man named Weezypan Little Elk. And his story is that he grew up on the Rosebud Indian Reservation, also in the Dakotas. He's Lakota. And that he grew up on the reservation. Both of his parents had attained post-secondary education. He went on to go to Yale, and then he came home and he was working on economic development for his tribe. That was the educational piece. The social justice piece was that he grew up in conditions of chronic and obscene poverty, and that he lost his younger sister. She passed away in her early 20s. She developed a condition after she gave birth to her son, and due to the poor quality of access to healthcare in the Rosebud community, she didn't get good care and she tragically died. So this woman had read this piece and, we were talking about whether we would work together. And what really struck me was that she kind of did this weird thing where she's like, well, I really appreciated his story, but, you have to admit, he's pretty privileged, right? Which really rubbed me the wrong way, because I thought it was really interesting to me that she was choosing in her reading of it to privilege the areas in which she thought he wasn't suffering enough or something, even though the context of his story was a collective community that was really being deprived access to basic their basic human rights were not being fulfilled, and he'd lost his own sister because of these conditions. Anyway, so I share that story because I think that stayed with me as I developed the book, because it helped me to think really clearly about how working for Native and non-Native readers, those two different audiences as with other groups, we all look at stories and see injustice in different ways. And the injustices that might be really clear to me may be less clear to others. So that conversation stayed with me because it helped me to think more clearly about who I was doing this work for. Yes, so that's what I want to share before I launch into my little presentation. Okay, so I'm going to share screen. I remember how to do this. Yes. All right, can you see my slides? Or you see like the weird version?
Yes, we can.
Okay, cool. So I wanted to talk today, and I know we don't have a ton of time, but a little bit about what oral history is from an Indigenous perspective, a little bit about resistance in an Indigenous context, and then like a little bit about the project and interview design that I used to put together this book. So when I was studying oral history, which was not that long ago, the way that we were kind of taught to understand its origins within an academic context was that it really began with this guy named Alan Nevins in like the late 1940s. And it started at Columbia, and he had all these ideas about how he wanted to like use the individual life story to supplement the official written record, which is, you know, fine. And that's a valid, Alan Nevins certainly made a valid contribution to the field of oral history. But since that time, there's been a lot of work to kind of expand our understanding of the field and the history of oral history. And one of the most important contributions has been by Napia Mahuika, who is a Maori scholar. He wrote this book, Rethinking Oral History and Tradition, that came out last year. And basically what he says is that when oral history sort of entered the academy, that our early practitioners made the false distinction between oral history and oral tradition, that they looked at the practice, the Indigenous practice of oral history, and they divided it into two. And they said that all of the stuff that has to do with your collective memory, all of the stuff that has to do with your tradition, your culture, your way of being in ceremony on the land, we're going to call all of that stuff oral tradition. And they likened it to something closer to folklore. And they said, the stuff that's oral history is the stuff that's really about the individual life. That's the stuff that we can authenticate. That's the stuff that we can fact check. That's the stuff that we know to be true in the way that we want to prove that things are true. And that's the stuff that we're going to privilege by putting in the archive. So Napia Mojica says that was a false and unfair and untrue distinction that was made. And he argues that it's not just Indigenous people who actually experience some cohesion around these two things, that all of us understand our own lives to be part of a collective greater than our own experience. So what he's inviting the field to do is to kind of re-expand our sense of ourselves and our practice. And he says, you know, if in fact we expand our idea away from this one-on-one interview and encounter, then we can allow oral history to include ceremony and song and walking and dance and performance. So it's kind of an invitation for us to kind of break out of the confines of the sit-down interview. What's important for me in terms of my work and what I want to share with you is that he does talk a lot about collective memory. And that is hugely important within an Indigenous context. And here I'm just going to read this definition from a book called For Indigenous Eyes Only, a Decolonization Handbook. It's a great resource. And they articulate collective memory to be, except for I can't see part of my slide because your faces are on it. Collective memory is knowledge remembered by people with an understanding. I'm going to assume I know what the words are under your faces, with an understanding of the interdependencies of their social, political, economic, and spiritual environment. Local knowledge includes practical wisdom to protect that world. Local knowledge and practical wisdom together form Indigenous knowledge, and holders of this knowledge are valued by their people for their collective memory. So collective memory is really the place that holds culture. And I think for people that maybe don't have a strong sense of what that means in an Indigenous context, this is a really helpful quote. If we fail to remember our ancestors, our freedom would be somebody else's freedom, not our own. Our destiny, the destiny of someone else. Our ancestors will not even be able to recognize us on the other side. We would have changed so much. If we learned the songs, the dances, and the stories, then we would have a chance to retain the distinct social character that is uniquely us. So most Indigenous nations have their own history. And many of these nations now have individuals, elders who are holders of that traditional knowledge, who have attempted to put some of that knowledge, which is normally passed down through oral tradition, oral storytelling, into a print form. Because one of the effects of colonialism is that not all Indigenous people have the benefit of having access to an elder who has that knowledge. So if you put some of this knowledge in text, then it means that it can be more widely shared. So the Mishomis book is one example of this kind of work. And this is like from my community. Edward Benton Benai had the ambition to put the oral history of the Ojibwe Nation into a book. And in it, it's really like, it's very simple illustration, very simple language about the life of a boy within the Ojibwe Nation. So within the stories, it really does portray and depict a way of life. So what is the Ojibwe way of life? What are the lessons? What are the values? What does that life look like? So of course, while many of the oral tradition and the stories have endured since antiquity, something else has occurred as well, which has interrupted the transmission of this collective memory and this knowledge. And that something is colonialism. So colonization and ongoing colonialism, this refers to the formal and informal methods, behaviors, ideologies, institutions, policies, and economies that maintain the subjugation or exploitation of Indigenous peoples, lands, and resources. Colonizers engage in this process because it allows them to maintain and expand their social, political, and economic power. So this is really where my work kind of begins. And this book, which is coming out in the spring, which I highly recommend, kind of helped me to position like where How We Go Home fits into all of this. This guy, his name is Jordan Abel, and he's Nisga'a. He wrote a memoir about what it is like to be Nisga'a without having had the benefit of growing up with the cultural knowledge. So all four of his grandparents attended Indian residential schools in Canada. In the United States, these schools were called boarding schools. And basically, they existed from like the end of the 19th century until the 1970s and 1990s in the United States and Canada, respectively. So this is not ancient history. And these schools existed basically for two reasons. One, because the settler nations wanted and still want more land from Indigenous people. And in order to promote their way of being the capitalist settler economy on the land, they needed to remove Indigenous people from the land. And one of the ways that they did that was through these kind of projects of removing Indigenous culture from Indigenous kids. There's this famous quote, like, from one of the Americans who was involved in creating one of the first residential schools here, that was kill the Indian, save the man. So basically, we're not going to take away this individual's life, but we're going to remove anything that would make them different from us, because we want them to become a participant in our way of being on these lands. So what Jordan Abel does is he talks about how strange it is to be Indigenous without having the benefit of growing up with that knowledge, because his grandparents all endured residential schools, and they were all taught that their language was shameful, that their culture was shameful. And so he grew up Indigenous, but without the properties and experiences that he believed real Indigenous people should have. And what's interesting about that is that that's actually a really normal Indigenous experience. Because of colonialism, because so many people have grown up with some interruption in the transmission of the culture or the language, or their removal from traditional territories. So this brings me to my work, How We Go Home, because my work and the narratives in it, I think, contain both that collective memory, but also an explicit analysis of how colonialism has sought to erase that collective memory. And now, most importantly, within the context of resistance, how Indigenous peoples are working to reclaim and rebuild Indigenous life and nationhood. So, the other words for that are to decolonize or to indigenize. So when I was thinking about resistance and How We Go Home, I was thinking a lot about, what is it that what are my narrators moving away from, but also what are they moving towards, and what do they want to bring with them from the past? Because so much of the work of Indigenous revitalization is Indigenous cultures, like any cultures, are fluid, but there are rich lessons and practices that had their origins in the past. So how do we move that forward with us, and how do we carry that forward with us into the present? So I believe that resistance and How We Go Home is about restoring collective memory through intergenerational transmission of knowledge. So storytelling is in and of itself an act of resistance. And the oral history interviews help us to see where there are interruptions in that transference of knowledge, and also help us to see the work that people are doing to restore the passage of that knowledge. So here I can use one of my narrators as an example. Ashley Hemmers is Fort Mojave, and she was one of the people that I interviewed for my thesis as well. And when I met her, the first time I met her was in New York City, and we did an interview that sort of got us up to her being 12 years old. And then she invited me to come to visit her in her nation. She had an apartment in Las Vegas at the time as well. So in an incredible act of generosity, I'd met her once. We'd spent 2 hours talking. She said, come visit. I'm going to, I'll take care of you. Just fly down to Vegas. She picked me up at the airport. I'd never been to Vegas, so she showed me around Vegas. She put me up in her apartment. And then the following day we drove to Fort Mojave, and she took me on a sort of day-long tour. We started the day at the place on the traditional territories where the Mojave believe that their lives begin. And then we drove around, and she took me to the two, what they call villages, to show me like where people are living there today. And then at the end of the day, she took me to the site where the Mojave believe their spirits go on. So in doing that, and during the course of the day, she was telling me the story of both like a traditional story that came from her tribal, like collective memory. And then she was also narrating the story of 3 generations. So she told me the story of her grandmother, her mother, and herself. And basically what she told me is that, her grandmother had been subjected to the residential school experience. She came out of it, as my grandfather did, with a lot of shame, having been traumatized. not really knowing how to love or to parent herself, because the example that she was given, her own experience, really deprived her of love. So she didn't come out knowing how to parent. And so that caused her to parent her daughter in a particular way. But over the course of her life, she started to heal from those experiences, and she started to see what had happened to her within a larger context. And she, through that healing, started to reinvest and settle into her traditional life ways. And so by the time Ashley was born and her brother was born, her grandmother was able to share that traditional knowledge, that collective knowledge, with her grandkids in a way that she hadn't been able to share with her own daughter. So within that one interview, Ashley was able to share with me collective memory that preceded any living family member's life. And she was also able to show me how the transference of that knowledge had been interrupted and had been repaired. So a couple of the Indigenous thinkers that have helped me in my work are Leanne Simpson. She talks about resistance in all of her work, but in particular in this book, As We Have Always Done. She says, when we think about resistance only as large-scale political mobilization, we leave out a lot of important stuff. We leave out all of the sort of everyday stuff, that speaking our languages and practicing our religion, all of these things are also acts of resistance, because we're here today, because our ancestors survived. And Gerald Weisner, he uses the word survivance to describe Native stories that act as what he calls renunciations of dominance, tragedy, and victimry. He prefers survivance over survival, a word connoting a more reactive position, which he believes captures endurance and resilience that Native peoples have, while acknowledging the remarkable effort required for resurgence. Okay, so I'm talking fast because I don't have a whole lot of time. So I just wanted to quickly share a little bit about how I tried to use that thinking into actualizing a project. So very quickly, when thinking about how to contextualize these individual narratives, a couple of other thinkers that sort of helped me with that. Alexander Freud is a Canadian scholar, and he sort of asks us as oral historians to be careful not to privilege the individual life story to the extent that we lose the important context that surrounds it. He says, and he cites the work of StoryCorps in particular, saying, as much as it's great that they're amplifying the work of oral history and some of their work is wonderful, that there's a danger in celebrating too much the success of the individual, that it kind of mirrors like the neoliberal value system, that we don't want to remove the individual from the collective because we want the individual instead to be understood within the broader social and historical context that we all live in. And kind of similarly, this woman, Sujata Fernandez, she, in her book, there was one example in particular that kind of stood out for me, and that was, she was talking about how workers of the Domestic Workers Alliance in New York City had spoken about how they were often told when they were being interviewed for like funders, videos, or for any endeavor that was intended to like bring in money for the organization, that they were encouraged to tell stories of individual kind of victimhood, like, oh, I had a really mean boss, and that was so hard for me, when behind closed doors, they were perfectly capable of explaining their position within the global capital economy, but that wasn't the story that brought the organization the most money. So I shared both those things because one of my greatest concerns when putting together this collection was that specifically working with Indigenous communities, I really, really wanted to avoid putting together a collection that was just a bunch of stories that were sad, or just a bunch of stories that were like about injustice. I really needed the stories to also be about resistance. Yes. So together, sort of thinking about how we could create a central question that would allow me to do both of those things, we came up with, this is me with Voice of Witness, came up with, what is it like to be a citizen of a nation within another nation whose dominant social, political, and economic interests are fundamentally at odds with your own? So this is Gladys Raddick. She's one of the narrators in the book, whose niece was taken along Canada's Highway of Tears, an area where a lot of Indigenous women in Canada are missing and murdered. So that question really allowed me to travel pretty broadly across North America and really engage with Indigenous people who had a real range of life experiences. The idea being that each of their stories would in some way illuminate an issue, some kind of injustice, but also some kind of resistance. We'll skip this part. So yeah, the central question allowed me to include a variety of narrators. As I said, my concern was that I didn't want this to just be a collection of sad stories that were victimizing or portrayed people in a way that made their agency invisible or the acts of resistance that they are engaged in invisible. So the solution for me was really to find narrators who could speak to both what they were moving away from and what they were moving towards. One of my narrators, Althea Guiboche, said that she thinks of it as, she carries intergenerational trauma, but she also carries the gifts of pre-colonial intergenerational memory. So she brings both of those things to everything that she does. So moving ahead to thinking about the editorial design of the book, ultimately there are 12 narratives. They are from, the narrators live in Manitoba, they live in Vancouver Island, 2 different First Nations there, Tsnemo and Tsartlip First Nations there, Northern British Columbia. I interviewed someone in New York City. I interviewed at Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve. I went to the Dakotas twice to interview at Rosebud Indian Reservation and Cheyenne River Indian Reservation. I went to Fort Mojave, the Navajo Nation, Santa Clara Pueblo. So it's a real range of life experiences that people are bringing to this project. And ultimately the book contains 12 of these narratives. Each one has a little introduction that I wrote that I kind of hope provides the feeling that you're being guided on this journey as well. And that, before you start reading the story, you have a little bit of information about the where and the history of the place, the nation in particular. And then the book also includes 3 really, I think, beautifully written essays by my fellow OMA graduate, Roseanne Gooding-Silverwood, which we included so that the narratives can be further contextualized. And one of the challenges for me on this project was that some of the narratives were immediately recognized by Voice of Witness as narratives that illuminated injustice, and others not immediately. So for example, if something bad happened to a woman's body, then that was really clearly a violation of her rights. But the learning that I think a lot of North Americans need to do is they need to understand that in some ways, Indigenous rights are different from other human rights. So Indigenous rights also include, they are more interested in collective rights and the rights of protecting place. So, for example, the story of a fisherman, Blaine, who can no longer support himself through traditional life ways because the provincial government has allowed capital fishermen to come in and overfish, that's also a violation of his rights. So there was sort of this negotiation that was kind of interesting because it helped me to understand what I needed to make clearer first with Voice of Witness, and then ultimately for, general readership, like, this is how Indigenous rights are different. This is what you need to understand. And then the way that we did that was providing some supplementary materials into the narratives themselves. So in addition to the introduction, I also, when needed, added interstitials into some of the narratives. Not all of them have them at all. Several do, and to varying degrees. But it's, whenever there was some additional contextualization, history, that we thought it would be helpful for readers to have right there, so they weren't going searching elsewhere to better understand what we were sharing in that narrative. And then the final thing I'll say is that I think one thing that I'm realizing the more I'm talking about the book is that in these stories of resistance, the solutions are also in the stories, and I think that's a really cool thing about this collection, and something I feel really good about, is that because I think I did succeed in finding narrators who are doing that work of revitalization, that so many of them are like amazing examples of the work of resistance itself. So whether that's Marian Naranjo, who's reintroducing traditional foodways and creating sacred spaces for her women to gather, because some of those sacred spaces that existed in the past are no longer accessible to them. Or if it's Althea Gwibosh, who worked so hard to recreate the feeling of the traditional village in Winnipeg by feeding the homeless. Or whether it's someone like Wizipan, who's creating economic opportunities for his fellow Rosebud Indian dwellers, so that they don't have to leave the reservation, so that they can stay and live as they want to live there as members of Rosebud. I think so many of these narrators, the acts of resistance, are in these stories. So I will pause there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's one of my colleagues and friends, Joseph Enton, says it's so crucial to have you hear your voice. You're talking about these stories. We are once again very grateful. I have lots of questions, but I do this for a living. So let's turn to the other people in the room who might have different kinds of questions. Because we're about 30, I think it's possible for us to simply unmute ourselves. If that proves unwieldy, we'll stop the process. But I would like to open the floor to anybody who would like to begin with questions. I'm guessing my colleagues, Professor Wills or Professor Britt or Professor Enton, might want to jump off. Professor Florence, anybody would like to start? Otherwise, I'm glad to.
I had a question for Miss Sinclair.
Sarah's fine. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, okay, sorry. I wanted to know the original story that you were telling about the gentleman that's sister passed away. Did you originally say that both of his parents went to college? Is that what you were saying, or I don't know? I kind of got mixed up.
Yes, both of his parents went to college.
Okay, because then I was like wondering, because then you said something about how like the lady said he was privileged. I was just wondering though. That's something.
And in many ways he was, and he is, compared to many of the people that he grew up alongside. He speaks about that in his narrative, that he did, having an education, and attaining an education is definitely a privilege. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, I honestly just wanted to know that, because I wanted to make sure.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting. Appreciate it though. Sure. It's a very cool, different, thing to do. It's a cool job filling.
I like it. Yeah. Very much.
It's awesome.
Kelly, did you have something you wanted to ask?
I do. Thanks, Phil. First of all, thank you so much, Sarah, for this. This is wonderful. And ironically, Friday, I'm teaching on collective memory and historical sites. So this was, I wish I had more students that came, but that's okay. I wanted to ask you maybe for myself, but also for other students that are in the room, when you spread your net wide in terms of collecting all your narratives, which was amazing. But with that, how did you sort of come to the decisions on showcasing the narratives that you did, and how did you sort of also set up? This is getting really sort of technical. How did you set up those contacts to even get to all those wide spaces?
Sure.
Right?
Yeah, very happy to answer that. When this book was kind of different from previous Voice of Witness titles, it's the beginning place was a bit broader. It's a really broad topic, right? I mean, and so we knew from the outset that there was no way that we could highlight every injustice occurring to Indigenous peoples in North America, because it's just enormous and there's such a diversity of experiences. But having said that, we also knew there were some that we could not include. So it was, okay, the legacy of the residential school systems, treaty violations, access to healthcare, access to education, the legacy of, well, the ongoing crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in both countries. At the time, the Standing Rock movement was in full force, and pipelines are always an issue, and obviously resource extraction period is an issue that we had to include. So we kind of started with those, like we would be remiss not to do this. And then kind of took it from there. And then as far as and then it was kind of connected to like my connections, right? As far as who everyone else was. And that really came through community. My first trip was to Winnipeg. That's where my Native family is. My dad's Peguis Nation, which is, we are Ojibwe. Peguis is like an hour and a half north of Winnipeg. So I wanted to start there because it just felt like a good place to start. And also it's like I think other than Anchorage, it's the second largest Native city in North America by population, by representation of the whole population. So I started there, and there's some really interesting work happening in Winnipeg around, like, there's an organization called the Bear Clan Patrol, which is an incredible example actually of like what could happen if we took more money away from traditional policing and gave it to community organizations. So I did some really interesting interviews in Winnipeg around like the intergenerational effects of the residential school system, how that created overrepresentation in the carceral system, and then also like how a couple different people in the community were trying to do the work to meet the needs of the community there. And that was just my own research, like what are the interesting stories in Winnipeg, because I was interested in the city in particular. And then I traveled next to British Columbia. My youngest sister, I have two sisters, my youngest sister was studying at UVic. She was studying in their Indigenous governance program. And I had identified this one woman up in northern British Columbia that I wanted to talk to. She was going to be like the person that I spoke to try to amplify the story about murdered and missing women. But I also wanted to explore like Vancouver Island. I think there's more First Nations on Vancouver Island than there are in the province of Ontario. So I wanted to go there. And so I started doing some research there. And then because my sister was living there at the time, she had some connections, and she's like, oh, I think actually one really interesting person for you to talk to would be this woman who's a student support worker at my college, Tracy, because her brother is a fisherman. And so I talked to Tracy, and Tracy said, yeah, you should definitely talk to Blaine, because he's the only person I know of our generation who's still living the way that our ancestors did. So I talked to him about how a changing environment was affecting his work. And then, yeah, it was all like, it kind of went on like that, like me doing research around, okay, there's a particular issue I want to illuminate. Is there a particular place that issue is kind of most amplified? And then within that place, can I find a narrator who can help me to tell that story? And then at the same time, just like I was talking to my own networks, like, do you know people that I should be talking to? And I think I probably interviewed about, like, not a huge number, but maybe double, maybe like 24, 25 people, and then ultimately landed on 12.
Thank you very much. It echoed my own experience echoes there. That's the snowball method is the way you find folks. You ask somebody and they'll tell you. Go talk to my friend, right?
Yeah.
There's a question that arrived in the chat that I would like to ask on this person's behalf. Um, she asks, I wanted to ask your thoughts about what you shared about the validation of voices in your book. This is a struggle I have heard often in my experience. Oral histories of Turtle Island seem to be easily discounted and have to go through an extreme process to determine their validity. And I wonder if you believe this might be connected to blood quantums and the U.S. enforcement of Indigenous people to be authentic. That's from my student, Julia.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I talk about that actually in my introduction. Yeah, I think, and that's one of the things that I really like about Nishka as well. Like, if you're interested in that question, I think it's a really great read. I think absolutely one of the reasons that I wanted to do this book was kind of to address that problem that you're describing, because I think that when people don't understand what the problem with mascots is, right? Like, people think it's, why should we be so interested in mascots? They're, it's a light, there are bigger problems. There are other areas that we should be focusing on. But the problem with mascots is that that's actually the only way that most North Americans actually see Indians at all, right? And so it results in this kind of idea, this portrait of Native Americans as like this thing that's stuck in the past, that has no place in the present. And it means that when they meet somebody like me, or my father or my sister, they don't see us as real Indians, and therefore they don't think that we should get to have a say. And they don't think that yeah. And so it creates real problems for Native people to advocate for themselves, when most settlers believe that actually we're not even really here anymore. And if we are here, then we don't look like the Indians that they think we should be. So yeah, I definitely, it was a big part of the reason that I wanted to do this book, because I think one thing that I've experienced in Brooklyn is that I think a lot of really well-meaning people just don't even know where to begin to have these conversations, because they know so little that they're embarrassed, And so I think if you like put out these kinds of stories, then at least maybe it provides an entryway for people to have a conversation in which they can learn a lot more, because at least there's something in these narratives that they can latch onto. They can come up with a question, it lets them know enough to start a conversation. So yeah, it was a big part of my inspiration, for sure. It's like, I want people to have better portraits of what contemporary Indigenous life looks like.
Thank you. There's a number of student questions, and I'd like to defer to them. There's one in the chat, and then I'll come to you, Gabe, if you'll hold on for a moment. This is from Malka. Her question was: you clearly heard many stories of pain and hurt. How do you prepare for that, and how do you navigate it in the interview itself?
Yeah, I think about that a lot. The truth is, you can't really prepare for it. I know, like, we like to have these smart answers for that question, like oral historians. There are sessions about, and for sure, like, if you were in a really intensive, immersive interviewing time, I think it is important to take care of yourself. And I know certain oral historians have really like specific rituals afterwards, like they might, after they're done an interview, like write something down from it, or they might tell a story to someone else immediately afterwards to try to like move it through them or something. The truth is, I don't have any particular practices. Hearing that question, there are 3 particular moments that come to mind. Sometimes, when you're really in an interview with like I was talking to this woman, Vera Stiers, and she was telling me this beautiful love story of how she met her husband, and the way she talked about him was like so sweet and so lovely. And she was telling it to me, and I was just so in the sweetness of it. I was just right in there. And then he dies in the car crash. And I didn't know that was coming, you know? And my eyes just immediately filled with tears. You know, it was like I was watching a movie. I mean, I was just in it, you know, and I didn't know that was coming, and it was sad, but it's okay. It's okay, you know, like I think in a way, it's not a bad thing for your narrators to see that you're moved by their stories. It would be a bad thing if I couldn't get it together. You know, but you take a deep breath and they see that you see their humanity, and then you move on, and it's okay.
Gabe had a question. Please unmute yourself, Gabe.
Thanks. Thank you, Sarah. Okay, make sure I phrase this articulately. So obviously you've gathered and such a wealth of history, personal and communal, both like a recent past and a far-reaching past, and have collected so many observations of like what contemporary life is across all these various Native communities in North America. And I'm curious to hear what some of the compelling maybe visions for the future you collected in these conversations, whether that's, you know, a material reality for what like a post or a decolonized world could be like, or maybe like more specific, like, I don't know, what's the range of different visions for a sought after future for these groups, understanding that like, you know, even though many of these different groups of peoples have experiences some overlapping set of conditions under settler colonialism, they're all also remarkably diverse and unique and autonomous in their own right. Did that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. I've been thinking about that, and I think you're right, there is a huge range. I think that to begin, I think that Indigenous peoples would like to just have their like basic human rights taken care of and honored, as all people do. And unfortunately, one of the legacies of colonialism, and then more recently the residential school system, the boarding school system, is that there are higher rates of all kinds of really hard things within Indigenous communities. You know, there are higher rates of there are higher rates of alcoholism, of addiction. There are higher rates of poverty. And so people like are trying to survive trauma. And sometimes that might make them feel like they're behind, but actually it's because, you know, there are lots of other people in the world who aren't working so hard just to stay alive and to survive and to get over the kind of like the legacy of trauma that they have been, that they've grown up in. So I think like across the board, that's something that people are working to get over, the healing that needs to happen, the collective healing that needs to happen. Because, you know, for like my generation, it's very unusual to meet somebody whose grandparent did not go through that system. So that takes time. That's like a project that's going to take time for, you know, generations now to be raised by people that grew up, you know, within their own families and culture and can pass on like good, loving care. That's one thing. And then for people who grow up in specific traditional territories, like my narrator, Ashley Hemmers, whose people were never moved, her experience is that. And then also, it's about stewarding a particular place on the earth, right? So I think that that's probably that's the experience of several of my narrators. And one thing that became really clear to me, because I was so fortunate to be able to travel to meet with them, is that when you go to these very, very specific places, like Fort Mojave it's a teeny tiny tract that borders 3 states, but the Mojave people have been there, you know, forever. And so they know how to survive on that land. They know how to take care of that land. So for me, when I have a vision, if I can imagine like there are hundreds of Native nations scattered across the continent that actually know in the most intimate way how to take care of and how to survive and how to care for a little place of the earth, that's actually so inspiring. And like when we're in this moment of, crisis and climate change. And so I think part of the vision for the future, like she wants to, when she thinks about, for example, the upcoming election, she almost thinks of it as, or maybe not almost, she does think of it as, okay, I'm Mojave first. Yes, I have an American passport, but I'm Mojave. So for me, this election is about, I can vote and I want to work to ensure that the people that I want to negotiate with as a Mojave are coming to the table. It's almost like, she has the power of electing a foreign government that she has to work with to take care of her land and her people. So I think that that's a really inspiring piece of it, is that there's a real aspect of stewardship that if we all better understood, we could really, there's so much wisdom. And I think like what I see that I don't see in my other travels is that there's a real focus on the earth and on what is sacred, that I think is a pretty huge lesson, that would be well absorbed by everybody else. I don't know if that's an exact answer to your question, but
Well, thank you for that. Here's another one that's come in through the chat from one of my students, Anicia, is asking, so can you describe your emotional state of mind when you're doing these interviews? I think she's interested in the impact of these interviews on you.
gosh. I just always felt like from the time I started doing this work when I was a student, I think it's like any, you guys are history students. And so anytime, you learn like more and more about history and like injustices that have occurred, that are occurring, you get kind of like excited and worked up and moved and you want to do something, right? And that was definitely my experience at the outset with this project. Was just, I just felt so full of like this desire to like get out there and learn more, and then also like very motivated by what I felt were the power of these stories. I think that one of my hopes is that, for people who haven't had the experience of knowing maybe Indigenous people in their life, that they will, first of all, like be more fully humanized. And that second, like they'll want, that they might work towards creating more justice, that in learning more and understanding more, that I think people will want to fight for each other. People want to fight for each other more if they feel like they see other people as, as much human as they are. And there are moments like that in the book. Like Ashley talks about when she was a 12-year-old kid, there was a nuclear dump that wanted to move on to their territory. And her grandmother would take her to these protests there every day. It was called Ward River. And her nation and a bunch of other surrounding tribes would go there every day, and there were camps and they were protesting. They're like, no, the dump's not going to be here. And there were settlers that came as well, and maybe some of them originally, wanted it to come there for the jobs. And she really talks about how there was this moment of transition amongst the settler population where not only did they, I think probably because they hadn't engaged with the native people in the area very much, they recognized their humanity and they were moved by their humanity. But also they suddenly realized like, oh, their interests were aligned. Like they lived there too. And actually, in the long term, the dump wouldn't be good for their children either. So I kind of hope that these stories like allow people to come together in new ways.
That's actually a terrific inflection point in our conversation. We've taken you a little bit over an hour, and I'm a little desire to be conscious and respectful of the gift you're giving us, the time you're giving us. Are there one or two more questions that we might elicit from, here's one that comes to me from Zach. Zach, would you unmute yourself and do this one yourself, if you wouldn't mind? Thank
Yeah,
you.
happy to. So, Sarah, I'm curious about your central question, and in particular, can you talk a little bit about how you introduced it to your narrators and when?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I think so. When I approach a narrator, I try to give them as much information as I possibly can at the outset, because I feel like it's way better than surprising them later I think it's better to give as much information as possible. So I would always say, first of all, I'm working on a book. It's going to be a collection of first-person narratives. This is the central question. So I'm interested in talking to people whose lives can illuminate this in a variety of ways. I would tell them right at the outset. And then often when if they were interested, the next thing I would do is I would send them a totally edited narrative. I had Ashley's and Wheezy's from my thesis, and I would send Ashley's as an example to say, hey, if you are interested in having this conversation, if this is something you want to do, just so you know, this is like the outcome. Because I think that them reading the narrative and seeing the kinds of stories that she shares and how in-depth it is and how like substantial it is gives them a real good picture of the kind of conversations that we will be having, right? It lets them know right at the outset the size of the ask. I don't ever want someone to be surprised by the size of the ask because it's a big ask. And so that was kind of my practice. And then sorry, go ahead.
And so you would send that to them by email before you even spoke with them?
Yeah. I mean, sometimes I would chat with them first, and then if they were interested, I would say, hey, why don't you take a look at this? And this might help you make your decision. It helped me in a few different ways, I think. I think one, it helped with the people that I didn't know, it helped them to trust me more because they could see the way that I was framing the story. They could see that it was positive. They could see that she was like fully human, that I wasn't like, I think they could see that she was being honored, but I think it also could help them to see like, and this is going to be a really significant process that I'm going to engage in with this person because that's not a little chit chat that produced that. So I think it was helpful, and I still do that when I can.
Yeah. I'm curious, what were like iterations of how you got to that question? And I know you talked a little bit about, you were saying you didn't want it to be totally negative experiences. You wanted to show resistance.
Yeah.
But I'm imagining that it wasn't thinking to yourself, I don't want it to be negative. I don't want to be resistant. That's it.
Yeah.
But it was. But how did you kind of arrive at that question as opposed to different questions?
That's a good question. So I had initially been working on a different question for my thesis. And that question was, and I have not thought about this in so long, but it was something like, how has the history of like assimilationist aims in education for Native Americans affected their experiences of education today? So that was that question. So in that question, there was also like a kind of moving away from, moving towards kind of thing. And I think so that was kind of similar about this. But when I moved to Voice of Witness, and when they said like, yes, we want to do this, but we don't want it to just be about the education piece. And they're specifically interested in amplifying stories of injustice, then it was like, okay, well, what is a broad enough question? What I wanted was a question that was broad enough for me to interview anyone that I wanted to, but it had to be a question that they would agree to from the outset. So that's kind of where we landed, because I didn't want to be limited before I had conversations with people. And I really felt like, well, that question will let me interview anyone, because, that's like any Indigenous person's experience. But it still felt useful, because it still felt like it provided like a contrast and a tension.
And also showed some evidence, like you were saying too, that you had an insight into what their experience was like. They knew.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. This person is here for me. Yeah, interesting. Thank you.
Sure.
All right, so there are two more questions that have arrived in the chat, and we'll try to end here, although I think we could keep you half the night. The first arrives from my student Natig, who asks, you've interviewed people from different generations. What was the difference in their narratives in terms of assimilation into the broader culture? Meaning, are the younger people sort of more Canadian and US culture influenced rather than older generations that you have interviewed? Does that question make sense?
Yeah. I would say no. Yeah, I think there's this interesting thing where, so like, I'll just say it in terms of my own family. My grandfather was a residential school survivor himself. He went to the Fort Alexander residential school in Manitoba. And he came out of that experience like pretty traumatized, having survived abuse. And also pretty shamed because he'd survived years of being told that, what he was bad. And so when he came out, he like didn't want to talk about being Indigenous at all. He didn't want to be Indigenous. So he raised my father and my father's 6 brothers like within the Catholic Church. They were altar boys. There was no discussion about who they were. And then my father talks about like my grandfather was one of 10. So it was a pretty huge family. And there were different cousins that would always be coming by and they would play cowboys and Indians. And my dad and his brothers would always want to be the cowboys. And then one day, one of the cousins was like, well, yeah, but you guys know you're Indians, right? And he described it as this moment where, like, of course he knew that, because not that this is a marker of it, like there are plenty of Native people who are not obviously Native, but in the context of that environment with like their dozens of like very clearly Native cousins in Winnipeg, like they were obviously Native. But he said it really like percolated and came to his consciousness in a different way. And so like the process of return kind of started for that generation. There's actually a prophecy called the 7th generation. Like the 7th generation post-contact will be the generation that kind of revitalizes Indigenous ways of knowing. And that was my father's generation. And so he did become, as an adult, like pretty involved in the Native community in Toronto. And then me and my sisters have all kind of continued on that path in different ways. My youngest sister started to attend ceremonies with some of our cousins and is learning the language. I have been kind of a student of history. And I think like, and with people like Ashley as well, I don't think that there's more of a disconnect from tradition or culture now. If anything, I think that there's like a real resurgence going on and a real critical way of looking at Canadian and United States nationhood.
All right. The last question comes from a faculty member, colleague, and I'll ask with the understanding that you may want to, we've already taken you to 7:15. This is something that concerns me. I find myself, the writer asks, dwelling on your point in the talk where you said that the individual in these stories needed to be shown in the context of a neoliberal economic order. I therefore am curious about the way one can place within that order the fact that your time, not yours, at institutions prior to 18 was basically meant to protect you, but in fact deprived you of information that would have allowed you to navigate the world safely after release. I mean, especially the lack of sex education and basic factual education. It seemed to me that the Christian agency had ideological reasons for leaving you in ignorance. But I see that choice imperative of the agency as a knock-on effect of that neoliberal economic order in terms of its props and governing attitudes. I wonder how you think about that agency as fitting in the neoliberal system or global capitalist economy that you've referenced. I hope that I've done the question justice. Does that make sense, or do we need our colleague to say more?
I think I might need the colleague. Who's the
Teague,
colleague?
you around?
Yeah, I'm here. I just think in light of Amy Coney Barrett's nomination and just going to the bench yesterday with the 6-3 supermajority, ultra conservative possibilities, that the fact that this federal agency, if I understood correctly, that you were in, I read the article that was linked to the invitation, with concern, and I thought that it was ironic, at least, that you were there to be protected from yourself and whatever nefarious influences on your life, but then you were ill-equipped to leave there and not even know how to get through the world safely. You're lucky you didn't end up snatched from a highway, I'm guessing. So, right. That's another statistic, right?
Sure.
So I just think that that's interesting to place that in the framework that you're saying that there's this distinctive sort of wider world that is complex and rather has dominating characteristics.
Sure. So there's a misunderstanding. I believe you read Jacelyn Charger's narrative. Okay. Which is one of my narrators, but not my experience. So so you're talking about her experience. Good. And so Jacelyn Charger, she is Cheyenne River, Lakota. And she had a very challenging early life. She was raised primarily in kind of the foster care system. And then at the age of 12, I believe it was sent to like a mental institution because there was a misunderstanding amongst her school community that she had tried to kill herself. When in fact she was trying to practice a traditional form of bloodletting because she was grieving the death of her aunt. So she ended up in this institution and was, really not well prepared for life. But as is the case with so many institutionalized youth, was then released at 18 and came back home. And as she describes it, really didn't have any idea how to survive. How to take care of herself because she hadn't learned any of the things that she needed to survive. And that sort of like echoes the experience of most of the residential school survivors who felt the same way, that they'd sort of, in many cases, actually, these places, they used the kids' labor to make the schools work. So the kids weren't actually receiving the same kind of education that their white peers may have been. They were laboring at school. They were the cooks, they were the launders, they were the gardeners. And so, in some ways, that there's that parallel with Jacelyn's story. And I think, like, for me, in terms of the connection to the neoliberal bit, it was more just that, Jacelyn is in a, like, if you only met her sort of in that moment where she was coming out of the school vulnerable and didn't have the context of what had happened to her people, what had happened to her mom, what had happened to her grandmother, what was still happening on her reservation, then you just wouldn't have all the information that you needed. Like, this isn't a story about a girl who is or is not pulling herself up by her bootstraps. This is a much broader story. So that's really what I meant by that.
Many thanks, Sara. I want to offer our deep gratitude. This has been fabulous. It's a wonderful hour and 15 minutes of time with you. I urge you all to go get a copy, like mine, mark it up, use it. Voice of Witness is a super interesting organization. This is one of the publications from Voice of Witness, Say It Forward, has a real interesting oral history primer at the very beginning. I know that some of my colleagues actually use in class. Voice of Witness also has videos up on their process that you can investigate if you'd like to. Sara, once again, we are very, very grateful. Thank you for this evening.
Thank you.
And we will be in touch because I've got to get money to you.
Thank you guys so much. It was really nice to meet all of you. I appreciate it. And I appreciate your questions. It was nice to talk.
Thanks again.
Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Good night.
Thanks for being there, Mark, and other guys.
Of course. Take care.
Really nice of you guys. Okay. Take care.
And thank you for Professor Napoli for inviting us. We will now leave you to your class.
Well, I was delighted to see you guys.
Yeah. It's really
Truly.
a great treat. Thank you. Excellent.
Hey, the rest of y'all are dismissed for the night. If you're done, you're done, unless you want to talk to me.
Professor, real quick.
Yeah.
Does Sarah do, I just went blank, public speaking at different locations? Is that what it might have come to
She's
the
not a,
hospital?
oh, you want to come to the hospital? She might. I'll give
Yeah,
you her email address. I'll send it to you.
please. Thank you so much. I
Nice.
appreciate that.
Seems like a very nice woman. Yeah. And she might well. Um, is there other stuff we got to do? All right, so like I'm telling you now, right? Ready? Thursday, my very first order of business is everybody goes on Dropbox and fixes their file labels. I know I'm a pain in the butt. Fix them. Because those things are floating around on my hard drive, right? And without a proper label, I don't know what I have. So please go. That's first thing. You don't have to do it now because I'm going to make it the first order of business Thursday. Well, I don't even remember what we're doing Thursday. What are we doing? Oh, scripting our oral histories, and we're going to work a little bit I'm going to try breakout groups with y'all on Thursday briefly, so that you can actually begin to put together a story. It's time, ladies and gentlemen, to make contact with your oral history support partner and begin to work up your story. We're getting to the end of October. It's my hope most of your interviews are recorded by this point. Maybe not most, but certainly more than a couple. And we need to be moving in the direction of getting this project finished. So that's what we're doing on Thursday. I got nothing else for you tonight.
Okay, well, thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Today's event was really interesting. Sarah was really cool. All right, well, have a good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night,
Thank you,
everybody.
Professor.
Bye.
Take care.
Take care, everyone.
You.
Professor, I have a question.
Go ahead.
So I still haven't picked what I want my topic of like my final essay to be. Like, I feel like last time we spoke, I was like, I don't really know what my real like main question is gonna be for my essay, but I'm just kind of at a standstill because I feel like I can't move forward without it. I've tried to ask a bunch of questions, it just doesn't, I don't know.
All right, so talk to me about who you've interviewed. I want you to just literally describe the people you've interviewed. Uh-oh, you just went mute on me.
Hello?
Now you're back.
I've interviewed 3 people already, but two of the people I needed to interview this week canceled on me. So next week I'm meeting with them. So next week I have like 3 people to interview.
Okay.
So all of them I've asked like generally the same things. And I feel like my main question does kind of want to be like, if there was change in the United States that refers to race, like what would it be? What can people do to better themselves and to educate themselves and know that they have privilege? I don't know if that's a good one. I kind of want your okay.
Well, what I think is that right, and I think we can learn something from what Sarah just had to say to us. I know that you had to click in a tiny bit late, but one thing Sarah said.
I was there the whole time because before you have Professor Mims. So we just transferred to the next class.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought I saw your, anyway, whatever, it doesn't matter. She said something about the way this happened for her. She was really interested in this, what are we coming from and what are we going to question. That was, resistance for her, and that's one of the reasons I invited her, is she's really interested in the same topic, is people who have one set of experiences who wish to move away from that set of experiences and towards some other thing, right? And what you're interested in is not Native American experiences, but perhaps American experiences with color and race in Brooklyn, right? Am I sort of right about this so far?
I mean, yes, but not in Brooklyn, just in general America. Yeah.
Okay. Good. Well, I mean, we're thinking about people who are local. It doesn't matter. I'm on the page with you.
I have everyone that I have interviewed, they're all from Brooklyn, but one of them is from Massachusetts, but recently has moved to
Great.
New York City.
It's that's less important for the moment. I just
Okay.
wanted to put my mind around what we were talking about. So that your questions, in other words, I think that the answer is already there. So your questions are about like, okay, so what has everybody's experience been of racial oppression, right? And so let's imagine, and I don't know your interviewees, but some of them have been racially profiled. The stop and frisk thing could easily be a component of the stories, and so what are they doing to work against that kind of world? Are they educating themselves about the nature of systemic prejudice? Are they part of protest movement? Did they do the George Floyd protests in the summertime? Are there other ways in which they want to move away from that experience of racial oppression towards some other thing? That story will appear in the narratives that you collect. It seems to me, given the questions that you're asking, I think I'm saying you're doing fine, right? If you borrow from Sinclair, anchor this around they see this as their world, they want something better. What is that better thing? How are they moving to that better thing? Not just what they wish, but what are they doing to get to that better thing? Am I making sense to you?
Yeah, you make complete sense. I think I have an idea of what I need to do now. Kind of like you're making it clear for me, but that's exactly what I want to do. Yeah, perfect. Also, second thing, I tried to put the Zoom into the Dropbox, but it's kind of like, I don't know, like every time I try to like put it in, it's giving me trouble. And on you know how one of the journals was to submit the
Yep.
first interviews you did, I submitted it, but you wrote that it wouldn't count until I put it in the Dropbox, but it's not allowing me to like
Okay,
put it
so
in the Dropbox.
and there's a whole bunch of potential reasons for this problem, and it's not yours and you're not alone. Okay, so what I
Okay.
want you to do is use this. I'm going to put it in the chat right now. There's a free web-based service that will transfer the file to me and I'll put it up there on Dropbox. I'm not going to let a technological problem affect your grade. Okay, so
Okay.
you're going to be okay on this point, but use this service. It's called WeTransfer.com.
Okay.
And what it does, not retransfer, that's one of these moments where autocorrect ruins it. TRANS. WeTransfer.com. It's free. It allows you to transfer files that are 2 gigabytes in size, which means you'll be able to send me the Zoom recording and I'll put it up and I'll label it correctly.
Okay, that sounds good.
All right.
I think that's it.
Excellent. I'll see you on
Thank you so
Thursday.
much. Yes.
Good
Bye-bye.
evening. Bye now.
Bye.